Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts, so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we're checking in on the Supreme Court with staff writer Mish St-Hill. Welcome back to the show, Mish.
Thank you, Victoria. How are you?
I'm well. It's been a while since we've had you on. How have you been?
It's been great. Thanksgiving was recently, so I had a great time eating some turkey and spending time with family. So that was great.
Nice. Happy to hear it. Today, we're going to talk about SCOTUS. This is your subject matter expertise, so I'm very excited to dive in. SCOTUS typically hears cases from the first week of October until the end of April, with most decisions delivered in June. As of November 28th, the recording of this podcast, SCOTUS has agreed to hear 41 cases during its 2022-2023 term, 34 of which have been scheduled for argument. The courts could still add cases to this term's docket, though. So what have we seen in terms of numbers over the last few years as far as the number of cases the court takes?
So between 2007 and 2021, SCOTUS released opinions in about 1,128 cases, averaging about 75 cases per year. During that period, the court reversed a lower court decision about 805 times, which is 71.4%, and they affirmed a lower court's decision about 315 times, which is 27.9%. To put things into perspective, for the last years, SCOTUS heard 68 cases in the 2021-2022 term, 62 the year before, and 74 in the 2019-2020 term.
That lower court reversal statistic is really interesting. I mean, it's nearly double the number of times they've affirmed a lower court's decision. So that's pretty fascinating. Before we dive into the cases this term, could you give our listeners a brief introduction into what cases or questions the Supreme Court deals with generally?
Just a little background info before we do dive in. So Supreme Court cases include a component called the questions presented. And the questions presented is basically a way of framing the case and sets the topics that are going to be argued. So basically, it's setting the conversation before the arguments start.
Got it. That's a great little primer. So SCOTUS agreed to add 2 new cases to their docket this month. Can you give our listeners a quick summary of those cases?
Sure. There's the Dubin versus United States, which originated from the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida. The question presented here is whether a person commits aggravated identity theft anytime they mention or otherwise recite someone else's name while committing a predicate offense. And just for a little background, a predicate offense is a crime that may be considered a component of a larger crime. And then we have the Jack Daniel's Properties, Inc. versus VIP Products, LLC, which concerns intellectual property claims and specifically the humorous use of another entity's trademark as a commercial product. The product in question here is a dog toy that supposedly parodied the Jack Daniel's brand. The case originated from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit.
That last case is really interesting. I actually dressed up as the Coca-Cola to a Jack and Coke costume in college, but that's a story for a different podcast, probably not this one. So we're recording this episode on Monday, November 28th, like I said. So this is the first day of December's argument sitting. SCOTUS is slated to hear arguments in 4 cases this week. What's up on Monday? We've got 2 that are in the same ballpark, so maybe it'd be helpful if you could point out how they're different.
Well, first up is the Percoco versus United States, which concerns the standard of evidence required to convict individuals of federal fraud and bribery. The question presented here is, does a private citizen who holds no elected office or government employment, but has an informal political or other influence over government decision-making, owe a fiduciary duty to the general public such that he can be convicted of honest services fraud? Next is Simonelli versus United States, which also concerns the standard of evidence required to convict individuals of federal fraud and bribery.
And then on Tuesday, November 29th, we've got a case concerning my home state of Texas and federal immigration policies. What are the questions presented in this case, and what are the potential implications?
Yep. So In the United States versus Texas, it concerns the state's ability to challenge the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's guidance on immigration enforcement and whether that guidance violates federal immigration law and the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA. The court's decision in the case could clarify the administrative procedures required for the executive branch to issue guidance concerning immigration policy. The decision could also shed light on the scope of judicial review of agency actions by clarifying whether district courts have the authority to vacate immigration policies issued by the executive branch.
And the last one up this week will be on Wednesday, November 30th. What's the story of Wilkins v. U.S.?
Larry Stevens Wilkins and Jane Stanton own a property in Ravalli County, Montana, that is subject to an easement which the U.S. Forest Service manages. In 2017, Wilkins, Stanton, and their neighbors asked that the Forest Service address problems related to alleged sporadic maintenance and increased use of the easement. In response, the Forest Service indicated that all management decisions were at its sole discretion and not beholden to the landowners. The petitioners filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court under the Quiet Title Act. The government moved to dismiss for a lack of subject matter jurisdiction and argued that the Quiet Titles Act's statute of limitations had passed. The District Court and the Ninth Circuit both ruled that the petitioners did not have a case because the Act's statute of limitations was jurisdictional. The question presented is the Quiet Title Act's statute of limitations a jurisdictional requirement or a claims processing rule?
Got it. So lots of interesting action going on this week. On Friday, December 2nd, they'll conference in a private meeting of the justices to consider cases. And then next week, SCOTUS will be right back at it with some of the highest profile cases of the term thus far, like the one that we're about to discuss, which is the story of 303 Creative LLC versus Elanus. And that's up for argument on Monday, December 5th.
Right. So Lori Smith, who is the owner and website designer for 303 Creative LLC, does not want to create wedding websites for same-sex weddings due to religious reasons. She would like to post a message also on her business website to explain that she can only create websites that basically align with her religious beliefs. The Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act does not allow businesses to refuse services to customers based on characteristics like sexual orientation and does not allow businesses to announce their intention to refuse to perform such services. So the question here being argued in the case is whether applying a public accommodation law to compel an artist to speak or stay silent violates the free speech or free exercise clauses of the First Amendment.
So there could definitely be some pretty wide-ranging implications of how SCOTUS rules on this one. The same will be true with Moore v. Harper on December 7th, which concerns the independent state legislature doctrine. Could you describe that doctrine for us and the conflict at hand?
So the independent state legislature doctrine theorizes that state legislatures alone are empowered by the Constitution to regulate federal elections without oversight from state courts. On November 4th of last year, the North Carolina General Assembly adopted a new congressional voting map based on 2020 census data. The legislature at the time was controlled by the Republican Party. In the case of Harper versus Hall, a group of Democratic Party affiliated voters and nonprofit organizations challenged the map in state court, alleging that the new map was a partisan gerrymander that violated the state constitution. The North Carolina Supreme Court initially ruled that the state could not use the map, but the Republican state legislatures filed an emergency appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court, which eventually led to the Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives, Timothy Moore, filing a petition for a writ of certiorari in the case. Should the court affirm the independent state legislature doctrine, the power and authority to regulate federal elections should become more concentrated in state legislatures and with the federal judiciary in the event of appellate review. When the case was granted, Republicans controlled 54.10% of all state legislative seats nationally, while Democrats held 44.32%.
Well, that's all we have to sum up for this edition of our SCOTUS review. Thank you, Mish, for coming on and explaining all this for us. It's a lot of complicated issues, so thanks for coming on. And if our readers and listeners want to learn more, they can subscribe to Rope and Gavel, which we'll link in our show notes. Thanks again, Mish.
Thank you, Victoria.
Hey everyone, this is Jeff Paulet. Looking for an internship? Ballotpedia is seeking self-starting and civically minded undergraduate and graduate students to join the Encyclopedia of American Politics. Our internships with the editorial, communications, external relations, and tech teams give you an immersive and hands-on learning experience. Ballotpedia's internships are part-time, completely remote, and the application for spring internships opens soon. To learn more and apply, search internship at ballotpedia.org or via the link in our show notes.
Well, hello everyone. Hope you all had a Merry Thanksgiving. Election season is finally over. Sort of. Is it really ever over? Not really. And you know what else is never over? Footnote Facts with me, Paul Rader. Except when the episode is over, I guess. But it's on now, and that's the important thing. So today we're talking about ticket splitting, which is when voters choose candidates from different parties on their ballot on the same election day. And today's trivia question is the following. Which state in 2022 saw all of its counties vote for one party for governor, and then all but one county for the other party for the U.S. Senate? I'll come back to this in a couple minutes. So split ticket voting, it's been trending downward over recent years, but of course we can't look and see exactly how many ballots had a choice for one party and then a choice for another party. So how do we measure split ticket voting? Well, we have a few ways. First, you can look at the party difference in who won statewide races, such as governor and U.S. Senate. The ticket splitting here becomes obvious when a party wins one of these offices and then another party wins another. Over in Kansas and Wisconsin, we saw the incumbent Democratic governors and Republican U.S. senators win. And in Nevada, New Hampshire, and Vermont, it was the Republican gubernatorial and Democratic U.S. Senate winners. And from there, you can look at the gap in voting percentage between the two winners. Statewide, the biggest ticket split gap was in Kansas, where incumbent Democratic Governor Laura Kelly and incumbent U.S. Senator Jerry Moran won with 49.2% and 60.4% of the vote, respectively. But note that some of this might change as official vote tallying continues around the country. You can gauge ticket splitting even with multiple statewide election winners from the same party if the difference in margin of victory is large enough. And statewide, the highest gap here was with Democrats in Hawaii. Josh Green won the governorship there, and U.S. Senator Brian Schatz won re-election with 63.2% and 71.2% of the vote, respectively. Again, though, might be subject to change depending on official vote tallies. Second, you can also take county level and, if available, precinct level voting data. This can show you how localities voted for statewide offices as well as for local candidates like county commission or city council. If different parties won, then ticket splitting happened to some extent. And third, you can compare statewide candidate voting to congressional and state legislative results, but you have to be careful. The differences in district boundaries make studying ticket splitting a bit murky. Unless a state or county tracks voting for statewide offices by congressional or state legislative boundaries, in which case that's a very helpful resource to have. The one state where it can be easier to tell ticket splitting at the state legislative level is Washington, where the state House and Senate districts are the same boundaries. And states that have at least one chamber that is a multi-member district can indicate ticket splitting as well, though that depends on factors like how many candidates you can choose from and how many candidates are running in the general election in general. Now, as we always do, we'll close out this trivia with today's trivia question. Which state in 2022 saw all of its counties vote for one party for governor and then all but one county for the other party for the U.S. Senate? And if your answer was Vermont, you get a round of applause. All 14 counties there chose incumbent Republican Governor Phil Scott. 13 of those counties went with Democrat Peter Welch for U.S. Senate. Essex County differed in that regard and just had to ruin the tidiness of this footnote fact, with only a 6-vote difference between first and second place. But none of these split tickets are as cool or interesting as a split ticket for the On the Ballot podcast. Speaking of which, it's time to close this one out with our host, Victoria.
Thanks, Paul, and I couldn't agree more. That's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Mish and Paul for coming on the show today. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back in your feed next week with a preview of 2023 elections. And until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.